I have a really, really vivid memory of writing "I'm gay" on a piece of paper and then throwing it in a fire in my backyard. And it was like this. It was there. It happened. It existed. I can remember looking at these words written down, but I couldn't dare let anybody see it. And I probably started around that time praying that it wasn't true.
That was writer, poet, and 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year, Willie Carver. I'm Buddy Forbes, and this is Queerly Quilted. So just starting off, just kind of talk to me about your story growing up here in the mountains.
Yeah, so I'm from Frogtown, Kentucky, which is near the town of Martin, Kentucky. From here, you could get there you can get there faster now because they just cut through the mountains, but it's about a 20-minute drive through Mud Creek and over some hollers. I grew up with hardworking parents who didn't always make ends meet because hard work isn't really enough to make ends meet. My dad was a coal miner. Mom was a nurse aide. And I went to Martin Elementary School in Floyd County. I went to Floyd County School, so I had a great education. I would put my experience in school in Floyd County against any place in this country because my teachers knew what they were doing and they cared about us. I had a really big family. I have each of my parents has 12 or 13 brothers and sisters. So once you figure up all the math, there's 150 cousins.
Wow.
And I feel like the vast bulk of them live within 10 miles of me. So my childhood was being schlepped in the car from aunt's house to aunt's house and feeling like the beautiful part was wherever I turned, there was family. And the awful part was wherever I turned, there was family. So you really had to fit in or else there was no escape. And I didn't fit in a lot of ways. So I think my childhood was spent figuring out how I would create a space where I did fit in. And I ultimately, when I pushed into queer spaces or academic spaces, I realized, okay, those spaces are pretty hostile to the Appalachian part of me. And I would say the first 25 years of my life were trying to figure out how do I exist when I don't really fit into any kind of space.
You identify as gay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When did you learn that?
Yeah, it's such a funny question because I think all identity labels have so much context and history and pressure built into them. So I knew in first grade that I had crushes on boys. And I knew, that I wanted to hold their hands or I wanted, to hug them. And I think I would have even known in my mind, I wanted to date them in that sort of way. But I went to a conservative Pentecostal church, and so we were taught that gay people were these horrific monsters that hurt children. And so I knew I am not that monster. I don't want to hurt anybody. So that part of me that wanted a proto-boyfriend in first grade or who wanted a boyfriend, by fourth or fifth grade, couldn't reconcile any sort of identity with what he'd been taught about what being gay meant. So I think I had built up all kinds of cognitive dissonance about sort of what it might mean that I wanted these things. Maybe I just want to be like them. Or maybe I'm not really a boyish boy and I hope that someone can teach me something. But I've known most of my life. Then puberty hits and then there's no confusion.
Right.
I probably didn't truly tell it to. I think by fourth or fifth grade, I had written it down. I have a really, really vivid memory of writing "I'm gay" on a piece of paper and then throwing it in a fire in my backyard. And it was like this. It was there. It happened. It existed. And I can remember looking at these words written down, but I couldn't dare let anybody see it. And I probably started around that time praying that it wasn't true. So I figure if I was at a point where I was praying for it not to be true, then I was already out to myself.
And what was that like for you? You said that you already kind of felt like there wasn't really a space for you. How did that contribute to that?
I feel like there are positives and negatives to it. There's a community depression that has taken over my entire generation. And so not fitting in was a really good thing for me because it meant I could throw myself entirely into something. So it was lonely and it was heartbreaking, but I think it also pushed me to try to find other spaces. And that kind of quest led me to a lot of places, let me meet a lot of people, and ultimately dissolved my interest in sort of being in a category. Because I realized I'm all these things, whether other people recognize it or not. So for me, the arc of the journey was figuring out what other people's role was and determining where I fit in.
Right. I know for a lot of us, and that's what I'm kind of hearing, that's what I'm making a generalization here. In this area growing up, there weren't a lot of role models to look to in the LGBTQ plus space. Mm-hmm. Did you see anyone or have anyone around you that you could look to and say, you know what, it's okay if I am because this person exists?
Not really. I had one older cousin who basically ran away really early on. And so there were kind of whisperings, and I knew that he existed, but no one really ever talked about him. I think the funny thing is ultimately my mom and my dad were both affirming and open, but there were just no words for it. So you can't have a conversation without language. So probably wasn't until college, if I really think about it, had a French teacher who would invite me to all of these conferences and events, and would always say, "Oh, I need you to come meet my friend Gary." And I would meet Gary, who worked at the University of Pennsylvania, or Tom, who worked in Florida. And it would be this sort of awkward shaking of hands and talking to someone for 30 seconds. And I called her years later and said, "I think I know why, but why did you do that?" And she said, "Because I wanted you to imagine a future where you were living." And it worked. It was really powerful to see these queer men having jobs and going to conferences and wearing ties and seeming like something I could be.
So you said early on you kind of came out to yourself, but when did you begin coming out to the people around you?
The first time was actually National Coming Out Day, but it was completely by accident. I didn't know it was October 1st, 2002. I was in freshman year of college and came out to a friend. I did it very softly, like I think maybe, perhaps, and her response was so affirming that I almost wanted to do it again quickly. So I started coming out to a lot of people. And it's amazing how quickly I went from being this soft, I think I might be gay person, to being like brazenly open. I kind of had this chip on my shoulder that I would have to come out to my parents. It was probably unfair of me, but I was just like, I'm just going to be gay, and they're just going to have to deal with that. Maybe subconsciously I knew that they would accept me, but I suddenly would just start talking about going on dates with guys, and I had, I don't know, T-shirts from Hot Topic that made it clear. And at some point, my mom just asked, and I was like, yes. And it was a good moment for me. It was a good moment with my dad. So in the course of 1 year at age 18, I went from being shy to being really outspoken, loud, almost in your face about it. And that was sort of the me that I developed in college.
And moving forward, what was that like for you to kind of craft and create these communities for yourself, and then to come home or exist as yourself here as well?
I lost a lot of family members. And I guess I could say it was their choice or it was my choice. But it's funny, my husband is long-suffering and kind, and he had a much more tumultuous experience than me, frankly, than most people. But his approach was to wait and believe that someday they would change. So he sort of existed in conditions that were not fair or good for him mentally, so that he could someday have parents who accepted him. Whereas I immediately drew all of these lines in the sand and said, no, accept me exactly as I am right now, or it's over. So when some of my aunts and uncles and cousins had any sorts of issue, like, I just shut doors. And I think in some ways it was because I had never been in a circle that I was like, I'm not letting you in the circle that I'm making. I can control this circle now. And I think what was really good for me with that circle was everything about gay pride that I know I learned from Appalachia. I learned from seeing my family and how they responded to stereotypes. How, when the cousin from Ohio was around making stupid comments, they would be all the more hillbilly, all the louder. And it was their way of saying, I don't know, I'll meet your stereotype and be what you think I am, but I'm technically the one who's winning because you don't even catch that I'm doing it. So it created a complicated relationship for sure with Appalachia because I love it so dearly. My heart is here. I believe in Appalachia. And I feel in a lot of ways safer here than any other place because there are parts of me that can let their guard down here that I don't get to let down in other places. And frankly, I think the majority of people are pretty open-minded. I think the majority of people are pretty good. I think the question is what we do with that minority that needs to be pushed in another direction. Where's the smart line or the safe line or the fair line or the good line between drawing a line that keeps you safe and sane and gives you dignity and understanding that being in community with people that you don't want to be in community with is part of the human experience and part of how we're going to actually change things.
And when I say queer Appalachia, what does that mean to you?
So for me, when I say LGBTQ, like the Q is almost queer. So like that's the word I remember being called as a kid for like, but it was never necessarily meant to insult me. Like I was just a queer youngin'. I wanted to read. I was not interested in motorcycles or four-wheelers or any of the other things that the other kids were interested in. Instead, I wanted to talk about the relative age of fossils or whatever I was into at that moment. So, like, for me, queerness and queerness are kind of the same thing. It's about recognizing that, okay, you're gay, but there's a freedom in just letting yourself be whatever you want to be. And what I like about queerness, the way I see it in Appalachia, is maybe there's just not enough people to have the sort of really tight labels. I find that the labels aren't nearly as dramatic as in other places. But to me, also, queer is just part of being Appalachian. Being Appalachian at its core for me is recognizing systemic injustice, recognizing that there are powers that dismiss you and ignore the history that's created the condition you're in, that ignore the context that's created the condition that you're in. And part of your job is to sort of buck up and make sure that they know. And that's exactly what my life as a queer person is. So they're kind of the same thing. It's called The Power of Ain't. A few teachers tried to tell me that ain't a word. But the truth will stand when the world's on fire, as everyone's aunt always says with raised eyebrows and lowered opinions. But on the power of ain't, my papaw fought against men in suits and built unions out of coal dust and hungry babies when he said that he ain't doing what men in suits thought was all he was ever going to be worthy of doing. But on the power of ain't, my mama learned the mystical art of transforming nothing into good cooking, into messes of beans and taters with ham hocks that her grown sons would cry out for in prison cells because there ain't nothing that craves beauty like one. But on the power of ain't, I set fire to everyone who said no or even dared to try to get in my way. And I filled my hungry belly with their ashes and used the glow from their funeral pyres to light a path to college diplomas written in languages I learned to talk better than them. Ain't nobody can tell me that ain't a word, because the truth is they're afraid of it. It's a single word of negation and power and taken back. A single pocket knife whittled stroke of breath that can hit you back with a switch it made you fetch from a tree. Turn you inside out until your just is unjust, and straight up shake the table your game is sitting on. And there ain't nothing y'all fear like hearing the holy truth pouring out of the mouth of some dumb hillbilly.
Wow.
Thank you.
And all of these spaces that you work to create, you've really carried that into how you, everything in your careers, several things that you do or have done, and kind of talk to me about how that has informed what it is that you do, from teaching to authoring, whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah. So, one of the things my dad said, I'm going to try to make this as PG as possible. When I came out, he goes, "Well, I wish you weren't." And I go, "Well, me too. But, here we are." And he goes, "Well, listen." And he said something to the equivalent of, every room you walk into, you got to walk into that room like you're the biggest man there. And I knew what he meant, because I'm soft. I cry easily. He meant you have to walk into every room like you deserve it. Like no one can take your space away. He was really talking about space. So I really took that advice to heart. And I said, okay, I'm going to walk into every single room like no one in this room questions my place here. And when my career as a teacher happened, I realized, okay, I'm now not, any teacher will tell you every movement is not about you anymore. It's about the students under your care. So I'm like, okay, we're going to move as if every one of these students deserve, without question, all the space that they get. And so that looked like me not trying, I didn't want to, for the most part, tiptoe into things. I was like, nope, we have a queer group now. And we're reading LGBTQ poetry, and we're reading Black and Brown poetry. And making it a point of defiance where I would want someone to have to say to me, they don't deserve this. Sort of create scenarios where the person who would stop you has to admit to themselves why they're wanting to. I was never perfect at it. I could have done some things more quickly, but I wanted to expand the lines that my students had drawn for themselves, and did that as a teacher in as many ways as I could. And not just in terms of like the LGBTQ students, but just in terms of their senses of identity. I've really, one of the sweetest things I've read someone write about me was one of my students who, I don't remember who even interviewed them, but they said, I realized week one, he was literally talking to this group of hillbilly kids like he actually thought we were going to speak French. And by week two, I believed it with him. And that's a type of drawing of a line. I think the feeling of walking into a class and knowing that the teacher doesn't really think you're going to learn the thing. And we can also know the feeling when they think you will.
What inspired you to go into the classroom?
Teaching is magic. It is magic. I remember and I probably thought about this a million times since becoming teacher of the year and having to talk about it, but I remember kindergarten. I have a really good memory of my childhood. And I remember going into the classroom and like not knowing the letter G. And the teacher would stand up in front of us and say like, we're going to learn the letter G. And then the teacher would say some things and do some things. And by the end of the day, like 26 kids sitting on some dirty rug who did not know the sound G knew the sound G. Like literally these teachers would say some words and do some things, and everyone was different from what they were when they came in the room. So I remember that feeling of possibility, a change, and thought like, this is magic. And then on top of that, school was this like constant for me when everything else in life was shifting. So, at home, people, maybe there was a fight, or maybe the electricity was cut off, or maybe there wasn't food. But like school always had food. School always had running water. School always had heat. School always had smiling adults. And I really could feel deep in my bones that these adults believed the things that they were saying to me, that I could do anything or be anything. And I just wanted to chase that feeling. I think I wanted to be a teacher by probably first grade. I used to teach my sister and my teddy bears. So it was sort of an inevitability. And then once I kind of really started thinking about, okay, I'm gay and I'm going to be a teacher, like how does this work? But I think that sort of came about during that defiant part of my life where I was like, no, I will just going to do it. And so that's how it worked. So
So what was the response as an open gay male teacher?
The funny thing is, for all of the problems that we see now, in 2007, I was a gay teacher in Eastern Kentucky, and I was openly gay, and no one seemed to care. Parents certainly had no issue. Students certainly had no issue. When I think about my experience working at the last school that I worked at, where I worked for 12, 13 years, any issue I ever had was due to that minority of angry extremists that I had already talked about, who would go make noise, and the school would capitulate. But I have, outside of one experience, no memories of parents being upset. No memory of any student in Kentucky ever having an issue with me being gay. The students just sort of took it as, yes, he's gay, people are gay. And that was kind of it. So it was good for a lot of reasons. I know that a lot of those students did not see LGBTQ adults. And I know the research. Trevor Project has done so much to show us how these kids think about the future. So I would stand in front of these kids knowing 60% of my LGBTQ students are seriously considering suicide. How do I make them imagine a future that they're in? And that involved in a lot of ways showing them my life. Not my sexuality. It meant saying, my husband and I were on vacation. It meant talking to them in ways that made them comfortable. It meant talking about biscuits and gravy. It meant positioning myself within a reality that they saw themselves in. And then also showing myself in a reality that was outside of what they had experienced, so that they could imagine themselves going into those experiences as well. And the kids were great. The kids were always great. It's something I'll never do again. I don't think I'll ever go back into a public school in this state. But it's something I would do over a million times.
And Teacher of the Year.
Yeah.
Kind of means something, right?
You know, I did not get along with the administrators at my school because I refuse to accept injustice. I won't. There's no world in which I'm quiet when we ban a book with a brown character because there's a brown character. There's no world in which I accept that my LGBTQ students have separate rules for them than my other students. And I made that very clear. And I think for the longest time I would basically just win because they knew, like, oh God, there's Willie. But I think with the rise of Trumpism and the rise of the alt-right, we started seeing places that used to be serious and credible start legitimizing things that lacked credibility. So when I got the nomination for Teacher of the Year, it was in an email, and it was like, you're a Valvoline Award winner or something like that. And I deleted it. I just kept thinking, like, this is some kind of scam. And the Department of Education had to say, like, oh, are you going to try for this? And I'm like, oh, this is real? And yeah, I realized I want the students to be a part of this. It did not occur to me I could win. Mm-hmm. So I said, hey, do y'all want to fill out this application with me? And I showed them the questions, and they talked about what they thought was most important. I let them sort of show themselves, because I thought, well, I'm not going to win. Actually, so the kids were making fun of me, first of all.
Of course.
And because that's what kids do. And one of them goes, like, they're going to let some big gay Appalachian be Teacher of the Year. And I laughed and they laughed, because we all knew, well, yeah, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then that night, I was just thinking about it. Like, this kid is gay in Appalachian. This kid is 17 friggin' years old and has already decided, like, you're not going to be the winner. That sunk really deep into my heart, because I thought my job is supposed to be to expand these images they have of what they're going to do. So I can't laugh along with them. I've got to pretend this is real. Mm-hmm. So even though I didn't think I would be Teacher of the Year, I couldn't let them believe that was going to be their reality, because I do believe things will get better. So I went in and said, okay, we're going to do this. And that's why they were doing it with me. And students wrote the letters of reference. I didn't ask any administrator at my school to do it. And so winning was completely a shock, because I would not have been Teacher of the Hallway at my school. No way, ever. And the process doesn't involve your actual school. Mm-hmm. So I think, if anything, those students were shining so brightly on that application that's how the win happened. It was really their work.
And now you're maybe out of the classroom, but mm-hmm. writing, you have a book that now people can hold in their hands and read. What is that like, and how did that come about?
It's still surreal. For 15 years, I was a teacher. Also, I'm terrible with numbers. I'll make up dates. It could have been 20 years, could have been 18 if you're out there listening. But for years, every single time I wrote anything, it was for my students. Every poem, short story, essay, like everything was me thinking of ways to show them something. Or even if there wasn't a text that existed, I would write the text so that they could study it. So I hadn't written anything for myself in a very long time. So while I was Teacher of the Year, some extremists started going to board meetings, and they were upset that there was a gay teacher at the school who was getting lots of attention and who was saying the words, "I'm gay in Appalachian," every time he spoke. Mm-hmm. So they were saying, if he's saying that he's gay in Appalachian, well, this man is clearly talking about his sexuality. He's sex obsessed. He's some groomer. He's hurting kids. He shouldn't be allowed around children. Lots of other things that I won't even mention. And these were people who didn't even have kids in the school district. These were homeschool parents who I later heard rumor of that some church in Tennessee was actually getting them to do this. And I had to get lawyers. There was some scary stuff, like mailing swastikas made of rainbows to my house with threatening things on the back. And I got lawyers and called the police and begged the school district to please do something. The lawyer said, "Don't talk." So I didn't talk. And then these people started going after my now former students. So they doxed them. These church members shared pictures of teenagers at their after-school jobs, shared their faces, shared their names, and people were scared. The parents of LGBTQ students at my school were writing the superintendent. I specifically remember one of them saying, they're calling the Teacher of the Year a groomer, and then in all caps, do something. And the school did nothing. The school didn't even, counter the narrative by saying what this group actually was. This was a group of kids who were dedicated to positive systemic change in their community. That was, they called themselves an LGBTQ affirming group as an act of positive systemic change, because they wanted to make sure that there was no ambiguity, that people were welcome. They raised money for mental health awareness. They cleaned parks. They wrote narrative history. These kids actually wrote their own curriculum and taught themselves queer history and women's history, because the school wouldn't teach it. And they were being vilified and put in danger. And one of the students ended up having the police intervene because the police were concerned for their safety. So it was in this moment, I'm on sabbatical. I started writing the superintendent an email about how furious I was. And this poem came out. Literally, like in the box of the email, like I had to hit enter a bunch because I had these ideas coming down. And before I knew it, had written the bulk of a poem. So I moved it to another file and finished it. And it was a memory of being at the Prestonsburg McDonald's, actually up on 23, when I was 4 years old. And every day for months, a new poem would come. And they were all these memories of being a kid back in Eastern Kentucky. And I realized, I think a lot of queer people see themselves as kids as in a very vulnerable space. And I think to escape that vulnerability, we sometimes put a bunch of distance between ourselves and the kid we used to be. And this kid was like reaching across time and saying, "Do you not remember how strong I was? Do you not remember all the things I did and how I got you here, and all the things I had to survive?" And it was like he was saying, like, "Man, I've already done this. I've done this and then some. Like, you're going to be fine, and you might need to remember these lessons. So that was the sort of experience. It was otherworldly having this kid inside of me want to write every day, and I just let him write. And he wanted to talk about Appalachia, and he wanted to talk about exactly what he remembered about the experience of being gay here. And then a fortunate set of events basically happened, and it was a fairy tale, is the short of it. Robert Gipe, who is he's a writer over in Hazard, who I adore and love. When all of the threats were happening against me, he was one of a few writers who reached out and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And my first thought was, Robert Gipe is writing, this is crazy. But then we were talking, and so he actually ended up reading the first draft, and then he wrote me back and said, "This is one of the 7 most beautiful things I've ever read." And I'm like, I don't know how to respond to that sentence. And then he said, "And don't be mad." And I'm like, why would I be mad? And he said, because I called Krista Wilkinson last night and read 2 of these to her, and she told me to tell you, you can't publish with anyone until you talk to her. And so that was sort of how it happened. So it was something really beautiful in a really dark time.
And what has the response been since you've been published and since that book has been on shelves and people can get it and you can see them getting it?
It's the first time I saw it, actually, someone had posted about it online. Noma Camuel, so Adriel Camuel's mom, had posted about it, and I was like, "Wait, how did you have that?" And she goes, "I bought it off the display, and there's a whole display." And I'm like, "Where?" And she was like, "At Coffee Tree Books in Moorhead." So I go, and like, there's a display of this book. So it was really surreal. And there was someone sitting outside reading it when I walked in.
What?
Yeah,
it's like a movie.
I know. And yeah, all of these good things just kept happening. So I got a group that I work with called Campaign for Our Shared Future. Their director happened to be in LA when I was there for an event. And she was like, "I heard you have a book," because she follows the Teachers of the Year. And I was like, "I do." And she said, "I'd love to see it." So she read it, and then she called me and she was like, "Okay, well, we need to have a big event. Let's have one in New York." So she hosted an event at the LGBTQ Center in Manhattan. So that was technically my opening event for this little Appalachian book.
Wow.
A writer from CBS who we were working on some stuff dealing with the banning of Black and brown literature. He basically says, "Hey, I think you deserve to be on Good Morning America, and I'm going to help you make this happen." And literally before I know it, he writes me one day and he goes, "Can you get me like a 1-page something that I can use to sell this? I think we can make it happen." Mm-hmm. And then I was on Good Morning America. And all of those things were big and great. And I think, I hope, especially for like young queer kids to see, and not just me, there have been quite a few queer Appalachians. Laundry Patrick is his online name. But there's a guy named Patrick from over in Grayson who was just on Good Morning America last week because he has developed this whole range of like cleaning things. I wanted them to see someone from where they're from. More exciting than that for me has been going around local places and having people respond. And I mean literally like writing poems and wanting to share them. And I've heard some people say like, "Oh, I hate it when someone at an event wants to share." Not me, not yet. So far, I've had 97 in-person events, and every single time a person comes up and wants to share something that they've written as a response, I want to hear it. And they've been such beautiful things. People who tell me they didn't realize how much they were trying not to remember their childhood and that it suddenly sort of comes flooding back to them. Mm-hmm. People who realize some of the dignity of their previous self that they hadn't seen before. Young people writing these brave things. There's a queer teen in Lexington who wrote after I spoke at their high school, whose librarian sent me a poem, and it was just this beautiful image of them as an egg that had been cracked, and this yolk is sort of free and exposed. So it's surreal, and I'm grateful. I can't be more grateful. And I think I always knew that academia would listen to a queer person. Even in my earliest days in college, we had already made that hurdle. We'd already jumped it. I think now I'm still sort of shocked when academia wants to hear from a hillbilly. But they do. And I'm grateful for that.
A large part of why I do this podcast is because when I was growing up, I didn't see the examples really. I don't want to say they weren't there, but I didn't notice them as much. I don't feel like they were as prevalent as they are today, which I think is great. You know, you can walk into a bookstore and see Silas House. You can see your book. And a big thing that I ask people, because this podcast is for who I was when I was that kid, you know, because I think he needed to hear us talk about these things back then. And I think you already answered this, but, you know, you said that young you was kind of talking to you through the book. Mm-hmm. If you could talk to young Willie today, what would you say?
You know, I think there's some impulse that might be like to tell him, you're going to make it, and you don't yet know how big you are. And I don't mean in terms of like fame or anything like that. You don't know how expansive your potential is, your creativity is. And you don't understand that the things that you worry about are going to be the things that you're celebrated for. But the truth is, what I would really want to say to him is thank you. Like, thank you for sitting in rooms for 18 years and not ever really being yourself so that I can stand here now. Thank you for not giving in to drugs that would have made this a lot easier to deal with. Thank you for every night you worked until 3 a.m. in college so that you could make it. Thank you for doing your freaking homework, kid. Like, thank you for all of those things you did. Because I don't think we ever collectively really give credit or do thinking to what these kids have to go through. I know adults who work at jobs that don't want them anymore, that want them to quit. Those people who might defiantly go, well, I'm not going anywhere, they last a month. They last 2 months. Because it's nearly impossible to stay in a space that doesn't want you. These kids spend 14, 15 years in spaces that not only don't want them, but that tell them the creator of the universe is against you. That tell them that their basic, the fabric of who they are is somehow wrong. Yet these kids persist. And they come out of it as artists and poets and managers. And I want to say it to that kid, and I want to say it to every kid who's here now, like, thank you for who you are. Thank you for who you're going to become. The University Press of Kentucky had its first PR meeting with me. They said, what are your biggest dreams for this book? And having a book was my biggest dream. But I learned for sure in writing this book that you have to say out loud the thing, you know. And so I said, to go on Good Morning America and to win a Stonewall Book Award. Like, those were the two biggest dreams I could imagine. And both of them happened because I was smart enough to listen to this kid.
And does it ever strike you how full circle it is that you wrote words on paper and burned them, and now you're writing words on paper and proudly displaying them on shelves?
I've actually never had that exact thought. No. It is weird how I've certainly thought about how full circle just the version of me that I used to be versus the version of me I am now. How some of his most pronounced traits were not as much who he was, but a response to the limits of his surroundings. I wasn't a shy kid. I was a terrified kid. I wasn't necessarily any smarter than anybody else. I was just trying to throw myself into something that wanted me. It's kind of, that is crazy to think about.
Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would want to talk about?
Just to say thank you. Thank you for doing this work. People are so excited about it. I love the concept, and I love the fact that kids and former kids get to see just how queer Appalachia is, and just how many people are making it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming all the way here after Pride to chat with me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
You can follow Willie on social media to see more of his work, and make sure to pick up his book, Gay Poems for Red State, and if you can, support your local bookstore in doing so. You can follow the show at queerly.quilted on Instagram, Queerly Quilted on Facebook, and send your emails to queerlyquiltedpodcast@gmail.com. I'm currently booking up the next round of interviews, and I really need your help and your stories to make sure this podcast can continue. Because your stories matter. You are loved. You are needed. You are important. You are queerly quilted.